I have with me Bob Varsha, the current host of Formula E races on the World Feed. In the past, he has done races for CBS, Fox Sports, ESPN, Speed TV, and TBS. He is perhaps best known for being the lead announcer of ESPN and later Speed TV's Formula One coverage.
I understand that you got into broadcasting when TBS hired you to cover the Peachtree Road Race, which led to you covering international sports, including Formula One and the 24 Hours of Le Mans. What was your interest in auto racing before you started to cover these events?
Well, actually, I get asked that question a lot because a lot of race fans tend to start it very young. That wasn't the case with me. I grew up in suburban New York, had very little contact with racing other than what we all saw on television on the weekends or read in newspapers and magazines, abbreviated versions of big races like the Indy 500 or the 24 Hours of Le Mans or the Grand Prix of Monaco might wind up in 10-minute versions on the weekend sports shows. But basically, I had very little interaction with racing at all, and very little interest in it, frankly. I went down to Atlanta thinking I was going to start a career in law. I was a distance runner in college and in high school, and had some success going to a couple of Olympic trials and a marathon. And I directed the Peachtree Road Race for a couple of years, so I just got hired out of the blue to be sort of an expert commentator, and that led to a job at Turner Broadcasting, which in turn led to a job with a motorsports television show, a weekly show about racing news and items of interest called Motor Week Illustrated, beginning in 1982. Did that for a while. They started sending me to the IMSA Camel GT sports car races to prepare video news releases, and I was just as raw as a cub reporter could possibly be. So that's where my interest in auto racing began, basically because there was a paycheck in it. But then I got to know some of the people involved and began to sense the thrill of the speed and the engineering and the bravery of the drivers and the sheer fun of it all. And so, the love story just took off from there, and that led to ESPN and coverage of Formula One and motorcycles and sports cars and Indy cars and on and on and on, as well as a couple of dozen other sports. So I've been very lucky. It's all been very serendipitous. I was just in the right place at the right time and put my hand in the air when someone said, "Do you know anything about water skiing?" And I would say, "Well, yes." And I will by the time the red light goes on for us to record a show about water skiing. So that's basically the way I made my way in my television career.
Yeah, I'd say with regards to auto racing, at least I might be a bit of an opposite of you, because I got interested in it because, well, you see, my father and and my grandfather also went to the Indianapolis 500 for years before I was ever a thought, and first went in 2004 when I was 5 years old, I suppose. I mean, been a fan ever since.
Say that, huh?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I do live in Indiana, so.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's the way it happens. It's passed down from father or mother to the children. Goes deep in the family. It's a family sport for those who participate in it in many, many instances. So, all of that dawned on me when I was finally sort of dipped a toe into the waters and got a sense of what this was all about. And it's been, as I said, it's been great ever since.
All right then. So who do you consider to be the best on-air personality you've worked with?
Wow. The best on-air personality I've ever worked with. Well, I spent 25 years traveling the world with David Hobbs. And I think David was that rare individual with a deep understanding of the sport, the ability to explain it in a very individual and yet comprehensible way. And he is just a fabulous raconteur, full of stories, lots of funny sayings, and just an all-around great guy to hang around with. So I'd probably say David Hobbs is certainly from a point of view of being an entertaining personality, I would say David. Now, I also worked with Dave Despain, beginning all the way back in the days of Motor Week Illustrated. Dave, who has been a member of the American Motorcyclist Association Hall of Fame for many, many years. Bikes are really in his blood. That's what Dave really cares about. But he also had a tremendous journalistic edge, and I learned an awful lot from him about preparing for television work. So I would say Dave might be the most talented pure journalist I've worked with on television, and I'll go with David Hobbs as an entertaining personality.
All right, then. Now, also, what do you consider to be your favorite racing series to cover?
Life is a smorgasbord. Depends on what you're in the mood for. I can have fun at just about any kind of race. I've covered just about every kind of racing, including boats and what have you. But forced to pick one, I would go with endurance sports car racing. I think the 24 Hours of Le Mans is my favorite race on the planet. You get your money's worth out of endurance racing. It calls for an entirely different challenge than those forms of the sport like single-seater open-wheeled racing or stock car racing or GT racing or motorcycle racing, where it's one athlete and one machine. In endurance racing, the athletes have to share that machine, so it calls for compromise and is a real test of driver skill. It can be exhausting, and it's usually happening in some very, very romantic and fun places to be. So I'll go with endurance racing and certainly the 24 hours.
Okay. Now, I suppose this isn't too surprising considering what I said earlier, but probably my favorite racing series is IndyCar. No, I mean I do. No, I mean I do follow Formula One, NASCAR, IMSA, and MotoGP. I mean, basically about every week, or at least every week it's on. That is. Now, also, who were some of the drivers that you thought were easiest to talk to, and I guess who were some of the ones that you thought were hardest?
The easiest drivers to talk with, certainly among active drivers at the time, probably Alex Zanardi, who is one of my favorite personalities in all of racing. He is such an extremely talented driver and such an amazing person, coming back from horrific injury to race and win again, and then change sports and win Olympic medals for hand cycling and so forth. He was always a fascinating interview. But perhaps the best interview in all of motorsports was a retired driver when I first met him, and that was Mario Andretti. He remains, in my view, the greatest ambassador for motorsports that you could have. His wealth of information and his willingness to share it. But there are legions of people out that are very, very easy to talk to. There's also a bunch that can be difficult. Some because that's just their personality, some because they just don't want to be interviewed. The late, great Dale Earnhardt never really wanted to be interviewed that much. Colin McRae, the great British rally world champion, could be a very tough interview. Another tough one is Bill Elliott. I came in when Bill was just in his golden years there as Awesome Bill from Dawsonville, flying around in his Ford Thunderbird at just phenomenal racing speeds. But I don't know whether it was because Bill is just a little bit shy, perhaps, about his own ability to chat comfortably with the media, or whether he just kind of runs out of patience. But Bill could be a very tough interview from time to time. Whenever you come up on an interview subject and they answer a question with a question, then you know you're going to have a rough time in an interview. If they ask, why would I do that? What makes you think so? That kind of thing, you're getting off on the wrong foot. But yeah, I suppose old Bill might be the toughest case I ever came across.
Yeah, it's interesting. You say he's the toughest and one of the tougher people to interview. Just kind of seems that his son seems to be big opposite of that. I mean, a real outgoing driver, that
Great.
is. Mm-hmm.
Good. Maybe he learned from his father's example. Maybe Bill told him, don't do that, do this. But it's good to hear that the younger generation is a little easier to work with. I don't get to hang around with the NASCAR people that much, so I certainly have no standing to talk about who's good and who isn't, since the last NASCAR character I interviewed was many years ago, I'd have to say.
Alright then. Now also, with the recent news of the France family intending to sell their portion of NASCAR, possibly to a
Mm-hmm.
media company like Formula One being sold to Liberty Media. Do you think that
Mm-hmm.
do you think that these new owners can help the sport and be beneficial or not?
Well, depending on who they are, yeah, they can definitely be beneficial. You know, a little new blood is never a bad thing. Um, the France family is in the midst. Well, I say NASCAR, not so much France family. NASCAR and all of its investors are kind of in the middle of a lengthy television contract that pays them something over $800 million a year. So there's a great revenue stream there for anybody coming in who wants to change the culture, change the formula, if you will, to try to make it more relevant, more interesting, more affordable would be great. You know, in the United States in particular, we have so much to attract our attention, so many television channels, so much going on, so many sports. Um, it's really tough to stand out. And NASCAR had things quite their own way for a long time, in no small measure because of the rift in IndyCar racing and the sort of, well, the same with sports cars for that matter. So those sports became a little bit more irrelevant. NASCAR, quite rightly, stepped forward and captured the imagination of the American racing fan with some great personalities and some great racing and some very cool cars. So um, they're benefiting now from that. But as we all know, crowds are down, ticket prices are up, television ratings are flat, sponsors are hard to come by. There's a lot to be done, a lot of rethinking. And, you know, give credit to the France family for all that they've done for the sport, but it might not be a bad thing if an organization with a more contemporary view of what it takes to be entertaining, um, what an affordable ticket price might be. Social media, certainly you need an organization that's pretty savvy when it comes to social media. There's a new generation of fans out there, and they love things like monster trucks and supercross and what have you. So you've got to tap into that, at least that methodology, if not, you know, comparing what you do with what they do. So long way of saying, yeah, if the sport of NASCAR were to change hands, it might not be such a bad thing having money to work with. And keep in mind, the France family isn't going anywhere since they own International Speedway Corporation and 10 or 12 racetracks and lots of other companies associated with NASCAR. I'm not sure the recent acquisition of ARCA would go with NASCAR in that deal, but you know, who knows? Sometimes, you know, a new broom can do some sweeping and come up with something that's better.
Yeah, I do agree that, especially when you look at NASCAR's current attendance and ratings, especially compared to, say, 10, 15 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
they definitely they definitely aren't out, but they are down, and I do think that with some new leadership, it can help them, and maybe help them get back to where they were before.
I think so. You know, things like esports, you know, which are so prominent, especially among a younger generation of race fan right now. You know, guys like Dale Earnhardt Jr. were sort of hip to what's going on the digital side, and and he was able to leverage that. I think it was a big part of his personality and his 15-year run as NASCAR's most popular driver. You know, you could say he was a big kid in a lot of ways, but but he also had that same sensibility that I think the new generation of young race fan does, and those are the people that you're going to need to look for. You know, if you're going to succeed, if you're going to continue to sell tickets, and it's got to be a hard act. I always used to think Formula One did a miserable job of honoring its own past, its past champions, its great races, and I think NASCAR probably could be blamed for that as well. I think they were late to the game in creating their Hall of Fame, in getting these great drivers from the past out there, reminding people of the great races that took place. One of the coolest things I've seen out of NASCAR in recent years is the retro liveries that they bring out for throwback races at places like Darlington in the Southern 500. That's cool. That reminds the old fans of why they fell in love with the sport in the first place. And it gives the young fans something to think about as they look at these cars and drivers and think, now wait a minute, where did these guys come from? What don't I know about this about this sport. Kind of raises an interest level, an education process that leads to better fans, I think.
Yeah, I agree. So I don't know how since you're currently in France, I don't know how much you I don't know if you've been in America since the Formula One season started.
Yeah, well, yeah, the first race in Australia, I was still in the United States, but 1st of April, my wife and I came over here. We're living in Paris now and enjoying the European scene. So, I've gotten that European perspective on Formula One. Of course, everybody in Europe thinks, Formula One is their sport, and they probably have a lot of reason for saying that. So I've enjoyed, reading the local newspapers and magazines and watching the television reports and so forth, because there is a wealth of Formula One on European television and in the media. Folks back in the United States have no idea how much there is here. If you're a Formula One fan, you can just eat, sleep, and drink this stuff all day, every day. It's amazing.
Okay. Yeah, my follow-up question would have been, what was your opinion of ESPN's current coverage of Formula One?
Well, I think we're all probably in agreement that they got off to a terrible start. But I think you have to look deeper into that situation. When Liberty Media, the new owners of Formula One's commercial rights, started to shop the rights, when it was time to renew their contract with NBC, and it became clear that they intended to get very active on the digital side. They were going to live stream. They were going to do lots of other things that companies like NBC and Fox said, wait a minute, you're going to be competing with our broadcasts. Well, we want no part of that. So I think, and this is just my personal opinion, I've not been privy to the actual negotiations, but I think they basically went to ESPN, which is strongly represented in Liberty Media's Formula One management structure. Sean Bratches, their vice president, I guess is his title for commercial operations, I guess. He was a lifer at ESPN, and I think he probably went back to his friends there and said, look, will you do this for us? The rumor is that ESPN paid nothing at all for the rights. They just agreed to put shows that were prepared for them on their air, and it turned out to be a little bit more of a challenge on that first occasion of the Australian Grand Prix than they could handle. And it was painful to see. It was very tough for the fans. Commercials came in the wrong spots. Because the shows were not being created by ESPN themselves, there was no review after commercial breaks of what you missed, which happened to include wheels falling off the cars of both Roman Grosjean and Kevin Magnussen from the Haas, American North Carolina-based team. So the whole totality of thing left a bad taste in the mouths of so many people. And ESPN, to their credit, stepped up immediately. They realized it. They published an apology. They said, we will do better. And I think they have, by going out and selling full race sponsorship without commercial breaks. Yes, you're watching a British television production of Formula One, but at least you're getting the same pictures everybody else is, and you're getting them without ad breaks. So I think ESPN and their associates have righted the ship to some extent. But if they intend on building that audience, there's a lot that they could do. I think they need American voices on the shows. And they need to really make it their own. Whether they're in a financial position to do that and make the kind of investment that it takes to provide compelling television, I'm not sure. We'll have to wait and see. But things have gotten better since that first rocky start in Australia.
Yeah, once they started presenting the races commercial free, I'd say things got a whole lot better. And I know you were saying that some people might be bothered by the fact that since it's sourced from the British broadcast, it has British announcers. To me, it really doesn't bother me. Now, I do also agree that probably in order to help grow Formula One in America, you probably do need to have basically American exclusive, or at least commentary sourced from America. That is.
Sure. I mean, that's only natural. I mean, you can't knock the British announcers because American race fans have been listening to British announcers on Formula One for many, many years. I mean, I mentioned David Hobbs earlier. He and Steve Matchett and Will Buxton and Peter Windsor. You know, we all had a great time for many, many years. And as an American, I was in the minority for a lot of that time. But still, there was that sense that you're watching a show developed for the American audience. And, you know, it's semantics and it's television nuances, and maybe a lot of fans don't even care about that as long as they can actually see and hear the action and understand what's going on and have a great time watching the broadcast, because that's what it's all about when you get right down to it. So, you know, it's not the fact that the announcers are British, but unless they address themselves to an American audience, you know, in a way that's relevant and understandable to the Americans, not too many inside jokes or you know, catchphrases that, you know, just are not familiar to an American ear. It's something that could develop over time, but I think it comes off as maybe a little jarring to fans in the short term. A long way to go.
Yes. Now, in general, what is your opinion on the future of auto racing in general?
Wow. Big topic. You know, in my years covering Formula One, I always used to argue that there is a really solid core of fans out there for Grand Prix racing, no matter where in the world it is, and perhaps no matter how it's presented on television. It's just that romance of and maybe sheer decadence of Formula One that appeals to something in the audience. And those folks are always going to watch. I mean, you could speak to them in Swahili during the race, and they're still going to watch because it's the cars and the drivers and the action and the color and the noise and everything that's really important. And I think that hardcore audience, whether it be for Formula One or dirt track racing or rally or motorcycles or whatever it might happen to be, that audience I think is going to be there. Whether it grows or not, whether it goes through financial fluctuations, whether it's well supported, whether it's well managed, as long as it presents a compelling, spectacular show, I think motorsports will be just fine. It's going to change, no question about it. You know, electrification is coming, the internal combustion engine, though it will be around for a long time, and maybe forever, who knows, certainly be around through my lifetime, you know, is going to have to adapt. Look at what Formula One and World Endurance are doing right now with hybrid motorsports. I cover the Formula E Championship, all electric racing for the international feed. It's great fun. The drivers are spectacular personalities. The racing is fun, but it's not loud. It's colorful. We go to some very cool places, wonderful urban centers all over the world, including here in Paris most recently. Tomorrow I leave for Berlin. We have Zurich, Switzerland after that, and then New York City for the first time ever. Last year, Formula E brought auto racing to the shores of New York Harbor. It was spectacular then. It'll be spectacular come July when we do it again. So, you know, I don't worry about the future of motorsports. I think it's too big, too diverse, and there are too many people who care about it, and perhaps more importantly, whose businesses depend on it, for it to ever, you know, substantially go away. I think, you know, motorsports have been here for, 100 years now, and I suspect there's a long way to go.
Okay. Now, going from that admittedly big question to something that should be a lot more basic, with the Indianapolis 500 later this month, who's your pick to win?
Well, wow. Boy, let's at least get cars on track and see who looks good. You know, you'd be tempted to say you've got to go with the big teams, the Penske's, the Ganassi's, those teams that have dominated in recent years, but we've seen some tremendous performances by teams like Schmidt-Peterson. You know, Robert Wickens from Canada is obviously a spectacular talent. He could well win the Indy 500. IndyCar racing right now is really one of the understated stories in motorsports. I mean, yeah, they had a big crowd at Indianapolis last year, and they will again this year. It looked like a pretty sparse crowd for the road race, the Indianapolis Grand Prix. Long Beach did well. Phoenix did not. St. Petersburg like a pretty good show. You know, they've been going through these ups and downs that are a continuing sign, I think, of the recovery from the years of the split between CART and the IRL. But IndyCar racing has so much to offer right now. I expect Indianapolis will be spectacular. Oh, who am I going to pick to win? I will go with maybe Scott Dixon, maybe Sebastian Bourdais, coming back from that horrific crash he had last year. Well, Scott Dixon had a big one too. And I'm going to be keeping an eye on Wickens as well. I'm really impressed with him.
Yeah, those are some pretty good choices. Now, I would have to say, if I had to pick just one driver, I'd have to say Ed Carpenter. I say that because, like, so far through practice today, like, basically, you know, have a variety of teams towards the top. I mean, you have Chevrolets and Hondas. Nobody, I would say, has a true advantage over the other. But I mean, you got Penske cars, Ganassi, Andretti, Carpenter, Rahal cars towards the top.
Yep.
And also, speaking of Rahal, I think that's also those three cars, Graham Rahal, Sato, and Servio. It could be three real, I don't know if I wouldn't say dark horses. I mean, Graham Rahal, he won 2 races last year. Sato's the defending winner. I mean, Servia, he was in the top 5 before he got him and Davison got together at the end. But no, I think that those are 3 drivers, in my opinion, you should look out for also.
Whoops, excuse me. They're all good choices. Sato's won it before, and before that he ran into my Formula E colleague Dario Franchitti in a celebrated accident. Graham's been sneaking up on it. You know, he could very well do it. I mean, it's great to have. They're going to have 33 cars out there. A couple of folks are going to go home. You have Danica Patrick in the field. That'll create a lot of attention. You know, there are just so many reasons to watch this year's Indy 500. It's a great thing for IndyCar. You know, who needs that consistent boost, so that wherever they go, people will turn out, not only for their spectacular events like Long Beach or Toronto or wherever, but for the other races that they go to, so that you can build a series, you can build these talents, you can build the momentum that you need to be right there on the radar in front of the sports fan.
Yeah, they definitely do need to, definitely will help them. Now, I would say that a lot of the drivers who have really started to hit it big in IndyCar the last couple years, like, say, Newgarden and Rossi, amongst others, you know, I think are pretty good, you know, with having good personalities, being successful, and, you know, being appealing to fans. I mean, you had Rossi last year along with Connor Daly on The Amazing Race, which certainly can only help bring attention to the series.
Sure. No question about it. There are so many great stories out there. One of the things about certain drivers in the 500 that just amazes me is, you know, take a guy like Sage Karam. Here's a guy who, you know, should have been Rookie of the year they gave it to Kurt Busch, I believe. I mean, Sage Karam was a terrific story, terrific athlete, former high school wrestler, terrific driver. For some reason, doesn't have a ride this year, but he'll go to the 500. And in the spirit of guys like Townsend Bell and guys who only drive the 500, get in there and fly around that place at 230 miles an hour or whatever. I have no idea how they do that, and I'm not sure the average fan out there, or certainly the casual fan, understands what an extraordinary ability that is to make that car work. A million years ago, I was covering a sports car race out in Riverside, California. Willie T. Ribbs, who was a spectacular sports car driver, was driving for Sherman Armstrong's team, I believe, and was going to the 500 for the first time, and was having a terrible time getting the car to work, to get it up to speed. And I spoke with John Paul Jr. at the race out in Riverside. He was driving for Conti Motorsports in those wild Buick marches. And I asked him if he understood what Willie was going through, and he said, "Oh, absolutely. You know, an Indy car at the Speedway at anything less than top speed will scare the daylights out of you. You know, it rattles, it doesn't steer, it doesn't turn. You're flying down the front straight, going into turn one, thinking, I'm never going to make it. You know, it just scares the daylights out of you. But when you get it up to speed, like an airplane, you know, that takes off, it rattles down the runway and then takes off, and suddenly everything smooths out, everything works, and it's kind of that way with an Indy car, I'm told, at the Speedway. When it's working, it's great, but it can be pretty hair-raising before you get it up to the speed that it's designed and configured for, and will grip in the corners and hold its speed and allow you to fly through the short chutes and then down the straightaway at these ungodly speeds. And that is part of the reason I so admire these guys who may only get into the 500 as their one race of the year and do these amazing things. I mean, that's all part and parcel of the legacy of the Indy 500, because a lot of guys have done that down through the 100-plus years they've been running that race. It's a phenomenal thing to me. I've been all over the world. I've been to a lot of racetracks, and I tend to think, as maybe a lot of fans would, well, you know, give me a little time, a little coaching, and let me test a bunch, and, you know, I bet I could get up to a respectable speed. I'm not saying I'm going to qualify. I'm not saying much less win a race, but I bet I could go. But I have been to a few places like the old Mulsanne Straight, when it was a straight and not broken up by chicanes, at Le Mans, and used to go over the Mulsanne kink over a brow headed for the Mulsanne corner, and I watched cars do that, and I thought, there's just no way I could ever do that. And Indianapolis is just like that. You look at that straightaway that looks so wide on TV, and then you go to the onboard and you see how narrow it must look to these drivers flying down the straightaway, and you're going to thread the needle down at turn one at 200 plus miles an hour. Not for me, not one little bit. You know, and that's part of the thrill.
Yes, I mean, it's certainly auto racing isn't for the faint of heart. Now you were saying you're talking about Karam there, about how he's so far he's only running at Indianapolis. I know the other day he was saying that him and Reinbold might do some races later this year, maybe on some of the road courses later in the year. I mean, basically he said it depended on if they can get through the month, practice, qualifying, and eventually the race without him or Hildebrand having any real issues, or could even, maybe it might even be Hildebrand in the car, he said.
Hildebrand's another. I feel badly for Pietro Fittipaldi, Emerson's grandson, who broke a leg and an ankle in a crash at Spa-Francorchamps in the World Endurance season opener earlier. I think it would have been great to see him out there, and that legacy of bringing another great name back to the track. But there's so many young drivers, so many good young drivers coming along in the series. And the same is kind of true of NASCAR. I hesitate to try to name any of them because there's so many. But what they need more than anything is the promotion and the profile, so that fans know who they are. Many years ago, one of my early mentors, Ken Squire, who's now in the NASCAR Hall of Fame as a journalist and announcer, once told me, people aren't going to stay tuned in if we don't know who these guys are, if they don't care about the drivers and what happens to them. Good guys and bad guys, black hats and white hats, they have to know enough about them to care. And that's our job as race announcers, as commentators, is to profile these people for them as quickly as possible and try to find that one thing that makes a fan say, wait, I want to see what happens to him. I didn't know that about him or her, and I want to follow them. I want to see if their dreams are realized or crushed or whatever. And that's a big part of motorsports as well, is that connection with the drivers that you're watching out there on the racetrack, and every series is duty bound to try to promote those young drivers, to get them out there and let the people know who they are, so that they can care about them.
Yes, and I do think like I said earlier, I do think IndyCar and especially NASCAR are doing a pretty good job of really pushing some of their newer, younger drivers. I mean, ones that are especially having success, like I mentioned, Newgarden and Rossi in IndyCar. But then, over in NASCAR, you got Kyle Larson, Chase Elliott, Ryan Blaney, Darrell Wallace, and others. But I mean, those are just a few, some that come to mind for me pretty quickly.
Yeah, I mean, there's these guys are coming in all the time. It just seems to me recently that you look around and you see that as the older guys leave, and take NASCAR for example, losing guys like Junior and Jeff Gordon and Tony Stewart, there's new blood coming in. There are new personalities in these cars. These are fascinating individuals, and they deserve our attention so that we can understand more about what they're doing. I'm hosting a cruise of race fans to the Formula One race in Monaco this year, and I was looking at the statistics about the 20 drivers in the field in detail, and the average age is about 27 years, which is trending younger than in recent years, but not by a whole lot. But there are a half dozen drivers in Formula One right now between the ages of 19 and 23, 24. I mean, that's phenomenal to me. I have a 24-year-old son, and the idea of him being in a Formula One car, much less an Indy car, a stock car, whatever it might happen to be, there's this new generation coming along, and they've kind of snuck up on me. So it's fascinating to look out there and realize, what was I doing at that age? These guys are so talented, and many of them so underappreciated to this point. Hopefully that will change.
Yes, and now I just want to say thank you for taking time out of your day to do this with me. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Thank you.